Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. I'm Dennis Normile, and I'll be the MC this afternoon. Before we get started, please join me in the usual ritual of making sure your phones are either off or on manner mode. We have our speakers this afternoon are on a very timely topic. Nuclear power and thyroid cancer, and whether it's related to nuclear or radiation exposure or not. Our guests are Robin Grimes, to my immediate right. He's Chief Scientific Officer of the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And to his right is Gerry Thomas, who is a molecular pathologist at Imperial College London. Robin Grimes will talk about nuclear cooperation in nuclear energy between Japan and the UK. And Gerry Thomas will talk about health effects in Fukushima. Each will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll throw it open to Q&A. And we'll start with Robin Grimes.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Oh, I think that was a little loud. Let me move that slightly further away. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. And I'll start by apologizing. The photographs have just been taken. I always blink, so I'm afraid you'll not have very good photographs of me, but, you know, there we have it. So the relationship between the UK and Japan with regard to Fukushima, we have based on scientific evidence that we have used to underpin what we do with Japan and the types of activities that we will be taking forward. The UK government has for numbers of years been trying to understand the process of evidence-based policy making in general, and we were at the position when Fukushima occurred that we were able to implement a lot of the things that we had learned on evidence-based policy making to the way that we reacted to Fukushima. And that has been really very important. And it has also been very important in the way that we have then developed our relationship between our two countries. So let me explain a little bit. I'm the Chief Scientific Advisor in the Foreign Office. So this is our foreign service. And most of the major ministries in the UK government have a Chief Scientific Advisor. And the Chief Scientific Advisors then come together as a network. So we engender a cross-Whitehall, a cross-departmental scientific community. When there is an emergency, such as occurred in Fukushima, which was not the first of the emergencies that we came together, we form a group called the Scientific Advisory Group in Emergencies, otherwise called SAGE. A terrible acronym, but there we have it. And SAGE develops the evidence-based scientific understanding and advice, which is then provided to something called the Cabinet Office Briefing Rooms, or COBRA, without the E at the end. So that is the group, usually chaired by the Prime Minister, which takes the decisions. So our job is to provide that underpinning evidence which the Prime Minister and his colleagues at the moment are able to base their decisions on. And as I said, it's not just Fukushima. It has been issues to do with cattle diseases, plant diseases, volcanoes, disrupting airspace. All of these have at their heart in our response evidence based on the science. Very different science, so that means that we have to bring different groups together to address these sorts of issues. But the Chief Scientific Advisors are usually part of that. I thought I'd also talk a little bit more specifically about Fukushima. In fact, I wasn't a CSA, a Chief Scientific Advisor, at the point when Fukushima occurred. I was an academic, and my academic research interests include long-lived nuclear waste and also nuclear fuel. So I understood about the issues surrounding reactor operation and the movement of radioactive species associated with fuel and waste. And so I was brought into the SAGE group as one of the independent academics which could bring to bear not only the knowledge but also access to a wider number of other people who were experts in the field who could feed in their advice also. And then we looked at all the advice and then took decisions as to what to say to COBRA on that basis. I have to say, of course, that it's all very well for a scientist to sit here and talk about all this logic and talk about how you come to these, you know, august scientific sort of decisions, but in the heat of the moment, it's quite a different experience. You're trying to make quite quick decisions, you're trying to get together all the evidence you possibly can, and you're working in a very intense environment. But nevertheless, it's still backed by this idea of trying to come to terms with that evidence. Now, I thought I'd also talk a little bit about Fukushima, the site, and the situation we're in at the current time. It has, of course, evolved really impressively quickly during the last few years. There are structures there which are real testaments to the ability of Japanese civil engineering. There is a very logical progression of removal of debris, of removal of materials so that workers can work there in more convenient circumstances, reducing doses outside from removing of material so that people can work longer before getting up to their dose levels. So at the moment, reactor number 4 in particular is changing from being a reactor to being actually a research place. By the way, in the long term, I think Fukushima will be an important place for us to come internationally to carry out research and understand these sorts of environments. And I really do look forward to a time when Fukushima is thought of as a place where scientists come to for the interest, excitement, understanding, and challenges associated with these sorts of environments. That is going to be an important international resource for us to continue learning and understanding about nuclear issues. At the moment, of course, they are still working through processes associated with water. It's a water management issue, very much. The water moves through the site, and how is that water managed? Now, there is, I think, generally, particularly in emergencies, a need for us to understand differences between hazard, risks, relative risks, and I know that Gerry will be talking a lot more about that in a moment. So I'm just going to keep my comments relatively simple in this regard. We understand what a hazard is associated with nuclear material. The real question is to understand what risk that provides, or, should I say, what risk that doesn't engender as well. That's just as important. And what is an acceptable response to a particular hazard because of the risk that it does or doesn't pose. And I think we have a long way to go before we get that balance right. I think finally, we're going to be running the UK-Japan nuclear dialogue for the rest of this week. And I wanted to highlight one thing, and that is the research that Japan and the UK are now carrying out together. And this is based on research excellence. We are really interested in working with colleagues in Japan because of the excellence in their research activities. And we will be talking about and planning new research projects this week, and that's one of the activities that I'm personally very excited to be involved with. I think I'm going to stop at that point. Thank you.
Okay. Next.
Believe it or not, I actually didn't know Robin until Fukushima happened, even though we work for the same institution. But Imperial College is a very big place, and he's on one site and I'm in another. And I didn't even know we had a Centre for Nuclear Engineering, because to a certain extent, the health effects are somewhat divorced from the engineering side and safety issues that we normally think of. But I had been working on Chernobyl, the effects of Chernobyl, since 1998. As you know the history of Chernobyl, in 1992 it became apparent there was an issue with thyroid cancer following the accident. And my interest had been in the molecular biology of thyroid cancer up until that point, mainly using animal models, but now moving into the human as we saw the after effects of the Chernobyl accident. So that was really at the starting point at where I became involved in working with some of my Japanese colleagues in Fukushima and trying to explain the health effects. There is no doubt that when you have a release of radioiodine, that there is a health hazard of thyroid cancer following that release. However, with radiation, there is a very good relationship between the risk of something happening and the dose. So if you reduce the dose, you reduce the risk. Following the Chernobyl accident, there was little opportunity to reduce the risk. It was a different environment that people were living in. It was a subsistence environment. You couldn't bring in food to that area. And to be honest, I don't think they really realized what they had on their hands for quite some time. With what happened in Fukushima, it was not the same sort of accident as we'd seen post-Chernobyl. And we just published a paper. It was the 25th anniversary of Chernobyl, the same year that Fukushima happened. And we'd actually written a paper which was published afterwards saying we'd learnt an awful lot from the Chernobyl accident, but the one thing we had not learnt, and it was clear from the reports that had come out from the WHO and from UNSCEAR, that we had not learnt as a scientific community how to communicate risk. Many people following the Chernobyl accident were very, very worried indeed that there will be lots of different types of cancer. All we have seen is thyroid cancer in those who were very young. And we said the one thing that we must never allow to happen again was for scientists to stand back and allow an awful lot of misinformation about the real effects of radiation following a nuclear accident to take hold. And unfortunately, that same year, a month before the 25th anniversary, we looked as if we were repeating all our mistakes again. The two accidents, as I said, are very different. The amount of radioiodine that came out of Fukushima is considerably less than came out of Chernobyl. And the Japanese reacted very promptly and did what was necessary to reduce that dose still further. And the evidence that we have, because of the measures taken to reduce exposure to contaminated food, because of the evacuation procedures and the simple advice to not bring washing inside so you didn't bring the contamination back in with you, reduced the risk to about 1% of the dose that we had seen in the evacuees from the Pripyat region in Chernobyl. So reduced the dose of radioiodine to the thyroid considerably compared with that of Chernobyl, thereby reducing the risk. And the recent reports that come from the WHO and from UNSCEAR have actually stated that there will be no discernible increase in thyroid cancer at the doses seen in the population. However, many of you will be very aware of the fact there is an extensive screening program that is now being conducted, and people are making a mistake in that they are using figures that we have from thyroid cancers that are operated. So these are patients who will arrive at their doctors with some form of symptom of thyroid cancer. So they'll have a lump in the neck, or they will have problems swallowing. Now, we know there is a natural curve to spontaneous thyroid cancer because thyroid cancer exists in any population everywhere in the world, which gives you a very steep rise in early adolescence into early adulthood until you're about 45, 50. And the Japanese population show exactly the same distribution as that. So when you screen the population, you shift that curve to the left. So because there is a known association with thyroid cancer and radiation exposure, people are jumping to the conclusions that the numbers of cancers that we're seeing at the present time are due to the radiation, when all the scientific evidence points to the fact that the doses were so low, we would not be able to detect a normal increase in that population. What we're actually seeing is a screening effect from the screening program. But we're still not communicating that very well to the local population and internationally as well. So I think the scientists and the media certainly need to look together at the evidence and to be able to provide explanation for a population that is quite frightened by what is happening, to help them understand. The doses are extremely low. You have more of a dose if you're how many smokers do we have in this room? If you smoke if you're an average smoker, whatever an average smoker is, you take in about 13 millisieverts a year of radiation from the smoke you inhale because there is polonium-210 in cigarette smoke. We're talking at doses way lower than that. Yet we're worrying about them far more than we do about the dose from smoking. And I think we need your help to be able to explain the real risks of radiation and not perpetuate the fear that we seem to be generating the population over radiation exposure. We need to be able to have intelligent conversations with people about risk, and we need to be able to have intelligent conversations about the production of energy for our future. And if we don't get the science and the communication right, we are going to cause ourselves an awful lot of problems in societies right across this globe.
Okay. And with that, we'll open it up to Q&A. We'll start with questions from the working press. Todd? Please come up and use the mic. Identify yourself.
My name is Crowell. I'm with Nuclear Intelligence Weekly. And, you know, in Japan, we have a horrendous decommissioning problem ahead of us as utilities decide to close down and decommission their older reactors, maybe a dozen reactors. Can you tell me a little bit of how the decommissioning authority of the United Kingdom works and whether there is something in that the Japanese could borrow?
Yes, one of the... is it all right if I go?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Your
Very
subject,
rude of
not
me.
mine.
So one of the areas in the UK-Japan nuclear dialogue where we'll be sharing our understanding and experience is in decommissioning activities. So the UK was one of the first nations to have nuclear energy, and as a consequence of that, we are one of the first nations to embark upon a broad disposal process of those early reactors. One of the things that is both a curse and a blessing, as it were, is the fact that we've got a lot of different designs of those very early reactors because we did a lot of research. So we've had a broad series of issues that we've had to face. So we believe that that experience that we've had and also the challenges and difficulties that that's caused for us will be particularly useful to our colleagues here in Japan. So that's why it's one of the really important things that we're talking to Japan about.
Should the Japanese establish a kind of centralized decommissioning authority?
So my understanding, and of course we're looking forward very much this week to talking to our colleagues, is that Japan is thinking about those sorts of structures and has made considerable progress in deciding on what sort of structures to produce. I don't know the exact details of that at the moment, and I'm sure it's still a work in progress, but nevertheless, we will be engaging in that with them.
Okay, further questions? All right. Okay, Justin?
Justin McCurry from The Guardian. Gerry, it's the second time today I've asked you questions, so apologies for that. First to Robin, you know, even TEPCO executives concede that locating and removing the molten fuel from reactors 1 to 3 is unprecedented in terms of its technical challenges. Yep. Are you confident that the Japanese and their international partners will be able to develop the technology to perform that task, and will Britain play any role in that, either the British government or British companies? And to Gerry, a quick question about, I mean, we quite often read that there is no scientific consensus about the long-term effects or the health effects of long-term exposure to relatively low levels of radiation. And you know, I'm confused as to whether that's the case or not. So if you could say a few words about that, that would be great. Thank you.
So these reactors will certainly, we've never removed molten fuel or damaged fuel. I mean, there will be a series of, the fuel will be in different sorts of states in these reactor pressure vessels when they are removed. So we've never done that in these sorts of reactors before because these sorts of accidents are so incredibly rare. So it will be a technical challenge. It's about remote handling. It's about, we think it's going to be a lot about robotics and the types of designs of robots. They will be very different to the sorts of ideas that you've got in your head right now as to what a robot is. I'm sure there'll be quite different designs for these specific sorts of jobs. I think it's something, going back to the sort of comment about this being an important laboratory, that we will learn a tremendous amount about remote handling, not only remote handling of nuclear materials, but those sorts of technologies that are produced here in this environment will also be used then in a whole plethora of different other industrial circumstances as well, hazardous and probably even non-hazardous circumstances. It is going to be a challenge, there's no doubt. Can we do it? Yes, we can do it, absolutely. It's going to be a question of how we come together to do it, and that's what we've got to do right. You know, there is tremendous opportunity to learn, and you know, you're forced into a situation here of learning. The challenge is there; it's got to be addressed. So actually, it's a strange thing to say in a way, but it's a wonderful opportunity as well, because we have to do it.
Yeah, coming back to your point about there's no scientific consensus, I think there actually is quite a lot of scientific consensus around the effects of low dose, sort of, you know, low, long, protracted dose. You have to remember that actually we're all exposed to radiation, whether we like it or not. We can't avoid it. It's a bit like saying, you know, you can't expose yourself to sunlight. Sunlight causes melanomas. There's an extremely good correlation between the amount of sun you're exposed to and the damage it does to your skin and your likelihood of getting melanoma. We're all exposed to radiation. We don't try and set a safe limit for sunlight, I note, but we do keep banging on about this safe limit that we need to set for radiation. You know, coming over on the plane this morning, I got a dose of 0.07 millisieverts, just getting from here, from London this morning. We can't avoid radiation. We're here. We're a species that's lived with radiation all of our generations, not all of just our lives, but all of our generations. If radiation at low doses was that damaging, we would not be a successful species and we wouldn't all be here. Radiation has probably made our species what it is. And we don't seem to be able to accept that. Yet we accept radiation by going and sitting in spas and breathing in radon gas. We accept radiation when we go in to have a CT scan or an X-ray. We have this very strange relationship with the term radiation, almost as if we can't accept something that's come from an accident, but it is quite okay for us to be exposed to actually quite considerably larger doses in some parts of the country. I used to get told off for mentioning Cornwall when I was doing BBC interviews, and the Cornish tourist authorities were not very happy with me. But there's an awful lot more radiation in some parts of my country than areas of Fukushima now. And in fact, I think the British Embassy did a cricket match recently, a year ago, I suppose now, with Tohoku 11. And in actual fact, the readings on the dosimeters would have been higher if they'd been playing that match in Aberdeen. And Keith will tell you that. He's from the north of Scotland. So why do we have this sort of idea in our minds that we have to avoid exposure to radiation when we can't avoid it anyway? We're all exposed to it. The water I'm drinking has radiation in it. And that's a natural radiation that comes from the Earth. So why do we have this problem with it? A small amount of radiation is not going to do us any harm. And I think there is a very good scientific consensus that says that. There's an awful lot of rubbish science that is produced as well. And don't think scientists will always tell you the truth. There is an awful lot of rubbish that gets put into the scientific literature, which is poorly controlled, poorly researched, no control groups, and so incorrect conclusions are drawn. But I think the evidence speaks for itself. We're all here.
I'm not sure I'd call them scientists.
No, I was trying not to use the word pseudoscientist, but I'm afraid there are a lot of pseudoscientists out there. Scientists are a mixed bag.
Further questions?
Whereas journalists are all wonderful.
Of course.
Sorry.
Dr. Thomas, I have one, if I might.
Yeah.
At the time, shortly after the accident, as they were laying plans for these screening programs and for the efforts that are now going on at Fukushima Medical University, we at Science spoke to some scientists who said that Japan had an opportunity to really nail some of these questions by launching a larger scale epidemiological studies where they would get a control population and do the same sort of screening.
Yeah.
And that was not done. At the time, the people at Fukushima Medical University told me that their main objective was to reassure the population of Fukushima. Did Japan miss an opportunity by not setting up a control group? Would it have been more reassuring to the people of Fukushima if Japan was able to point to the control group and say that here's the data from the control group, here's the data from Fukushima?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think doing this without a control group means you have a hell of a lot of problems explaining what you find. If this was an animal experiment, there is no way we would have set it up in this way. But we do have a tendency of doing this with human subject research, which I think actually really doesn't help us. I think there was a golden opportunity to set up a control group. And I would have stuck by that, apart from a conversation I had with one of the mothers in Fukushima, whose own child had gone through the screening program. And I said to her, you know, one of the things that we should have done was to set up a control group. And she said, you know, having been through it myself, I would never want to put another woman through what I've been through. So you have the stress of the control population also having to go through the same medical examinations. And we all know what it's like. If we're honest, if a doctor calls you in and says, I want to give you a CT scan or an ultrasound scan, we are all worried. We can't avoid that. That's just us being human. So I think it should have been done. But I think you are stuck between a rock and a hard place, because you're damned if you do it and you're damned if you don't. There was a small study that was set up using the same ultrasound equipment and the same skilled group of medics doing this, because a lot of the results come from the skill of the people operating the equipment and the technicality of the equipment themselves. And they actually found that the frequency of thyroid tumours and thyroid nodules was exactly the same. In fact, it was slightly lower in Fukushima Prefecture than it was in the other 3 prefectures they looked at. But the caveat to that was only about 4,000 individuals who were studied. And that's not a big enough control group, really, to draw strong conclusions from.
Was that published?
I'm reviewing it at the moment. They have published the early stuff on the nodules, but they hadn't gone through to complete. The way this works is if a patient comes in and has a scan and there's something unusual about the thyroid, what will then happen is that they put a needle into the thyroid, draw the cells out, and will then look at the cells. Some thyroid cancers you can tell immediately just from that examination. Others you have to wait until it goes through to completion to operation. Now, because you don't need to rush into a thyroid operation, because it's a slow-growing tumour that has very little fatality associated with it, you allow plenty of time for that procedure. So you may have a diagnosis on a fine needle biopsy of a thyroid cancer 2 or 3 years before it's operated, and it's not going to do you any harm. It's not like other cancers. So there's a lag period between getting the information from the ultrasound and getting the final conclusions from the pathology, and that's what we've been waiting to play through. I believe they've now got to that point where they need to publish it. But I think they're finding it a little bit difficult to get it published because they published the early results before, and people are saying, well, what does this add? Because it doesn't really tell us anything else. And the answer is that little tiny bit that tells you how small a fraction of cancers really is in that control population is quite important when you compare it with what's going on in Fukushima. But scientifically, everybody's going, oh, it doesn't show us anything. So it's difficult. Sometimes it's very difficult to publish things in the scientific media. It's very much easier to publish them in the journalistic media, unfortunately.
I mean, this actually brings us to these sort of concepts, such as the worried well. I don't know whether that's a common understood term here.
Yeah, I mean, it does.
The worried well.
Right.
It's like if we said to all the men in this room, we're going to give you a prostate examination, you'd all be worried we'd find something nasty. And if we didn't find something nasty, you'd still be worrying that it might be nasty in the future. And that's what we term the worried well. People who are actually not ill, but are worried that they may become ill because of a medical intervention, of a screening program or something like that, that's suggested and put in the back of your minds, there might be something wrong with me. And of course, we're finding more and more things that way now. I mean, things like renal cancers. would have gone undiagnosed and the patient would have died of something else, but because we're giving more and more CT abdominal scans when somebody goes in with a pain, which could be a hiatus hernia, which is incredibly common in the ageing population, we then find there's a renal cancer, so we have to do something about it, whereas most people would have died with their renal cancer, and because we don't do many post-mortems any longer, you would never have known you had a renal cancer. And it's like thyroid cancer. There have been reports that if you do post-mortems and you thinly slice the thyroid, you will find that about 50% of the population has a thyroid cancer. It's just sitting there doing nothing, and it's so small that it's not going to do anything.
But I bet now there's quite a lot of people in this room who are slightly more worried than they were a few minutes ago.
Exactly. Unfortunately, quite a few of you are probably harbouring things that you really don't want to know about.
Don't say. I mean,
Further questions?
Sorry.
Okay, are you working journalist? Well, the journalists don't have any questions, so please.
Yes.
Now go ahead. Yes, if you come to the microphone. We are recording this.
Thank you very much. Let me pose my question to Gerry. I understand authorities in Fukushima have been going through the detection of thyroid cancer among children. And what is the current situation of that test? Thank you.
Yeah, as I tried to explain before, this is a long procedure. So you start with the first scan, which was, and these scans that have just been done were to give us a baseline. So you start with the first scans. If there's something unusual, you then progress to perhaps having a needle biopsy. If it's something unusual that doesn't look as if it's going to cause problems, you might say to somebody, come back in 6 months, a year, 2 years' time. Then you'd progress after the needle biopsy to possibly having an operation, but it depends on the size of the tumour. So in the thyroid, you've got lots of little round things called follicles, which is where you make the thyroid hormones. And under the microscope, when I've looking at something that's come from a patient who's been operated for a very obvious tumour elsewhere in the thyroid, you can often find tiny weeny tumours that are just one follicle, so about 50 microns across. So they're very, very tiny. Now, with the sort of ultrasound scans that you're seeing done at the moment, the sensitivity is they can pick up things that are, many less than a millimetre. And really and truly, they're probably best left where they are. They are not going to grow quickly, and you can monitor that patient. So often, it'll be 2-3 years, perhaps, before that patient goes for operation, maybe longer. And until the patient has the operation, you don't have a definitive diagnosis. So that's why it takes so long. And at the moment, they have just done the first round, and I think there are still a few cases where they need to do the operation to confirm whether the tumour is malignant or not. And I think it's 57 cases they've found, but they've screened nearly 300,000 patients. The vast majority of those, nothing at all in their thyroid. A few of them will have had little nodules or cysts, which most of us have and are blissfully unaware of. And then a small fraction, again, have gone on to have thyroid cancer. But you would see that increase as that population aged. You just wouldn't see it that early because there's this big sort of hump of natural increase in thyroid cancer as you hit puberty going into early adulthood. So they've done the first round. They will then repeat. I think it's every 2 years, I think, if I remember correctly, they're repeating. And then you'll probably find there'll be many less in 2 years' time because they've found that little hump of cases now. So it's going to be many, many years of repeated information coming out. And I think we're going to be very reliant on you being able to help the public interpret that information. Because you can give statistics out, but if you don't explain the biology, the natural history, and what it really means to people, then you can get a completely false impression of what those figures really mean. And there needs to be an awful lot more education. Biology is very complicated. As humans, we are incredibly complicated. And lots of things cause cancer. So we can't jump to conclusions that just because we find a cancer, it must be due to the radiation. It's going to be a long, drawn-out process. But the evidence that we have at the moment, and from the discussions that have been had by the WHO and SCIA, and there'll be a new report out from the IAEA as well, all point to the fact that the doses were so low, we won't be able to find an increase in thyroid cancer because the Japanese did the right thing. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Well, just a short one.
Yeah.
To my knowledge.
Please use the microphone. We're recording, so please use the microphone.
Sorry.
50 micron, by the way, is about half a millimetre.
Thank you very much. To my knowledge, if my memory is correct, in comparison with the Chernobyl tragedy, at the early stage of the tragedy in Chernobyl, thyroid phenomena among children were quite evident, and that which means, I think, which I interpret as the fact that radiation was very spread.
Yeah. There's several things there. The population of children exposed to radiation was 10 million following Chernobyl because it was a much bigger accident with more iodine. So 10 million children in total were exposed. You've only got 360,000 of the same age exposed in Japan. The iodine dose was much lower, and it took, well, the first signs, the very first signs, was about 1990, so it took 4 years to see anything at all. Also, the area around Chernobyl is iodine insufficient. There isn't very much iodine in the soil. So that means all the binding sites within the thyroid, because it actually takes up iodine, it's like a sponge, it takes it up, holds onto it. It means there was more room for the iodine to go into the thyroids of the children in Chernobyl. Also, they drank a lot more milk and things than you do in Japan. So there are many reasons why the thyroid increase was higher, and we didn't see anything until 4 years afterwards. That was the first inkling we had, was 4 years, and it was 6 years before the first concrete studies were published that definitely showed there was an increase and it was related to the iodine. But even then, they were disputed. So we're 3 years after the accident. This screening has now been completed. So that is our baseline, which gives us a rate of about 3 per 10,000, which is exactly what we would have predicted from what we understand about the normal frequency that we know from operations. And it's the same frequency in the 3 different prefectures that they used as a control population, although with many fewer people in it.
Thank you very much.
Just for reference, I have this number here. Fukushima Medical University announced either in July or August, I forget, they screened 296,000 children and have identified 57 cases of thyroid cancer. If you Google that, it was, I forget the exact date.
Yeah, I think it was August. I think it was August, yeah.
Further questions? Yes, James.
Besides the frequency of thyroid cancer, is there any evidence that radiation exposure could lead to metastases? Because that's, as you were saying, that you can let a thyroid cancer go for a long time, but if you've got it metastasized, then you can't. And then the second part is, I know you're not an expert in radiation measurement itself, but there's a lot of controversy about how you measure the radiation. If you measure it right on the ground where children might crawl, or up a couple of meters where an adult might be. So can you comment about that?
I'm sorry, James, could you give us your...
Yeah. I'm from Tsukuba University, James Cole.
So First of all, the comment about the radiation being on the ground. Actually, the iodine's gone. The iodine went within 3 months. So anything that's now on the ground is not iodine. And all the evidence we have from Chernobyl is cesium doesn't do anything. And there's a very good reason for that. The dose that a tissue receives is a combination of biology, physics, and chemistry. So it's a combination of the physical half-life of the individual elements, and iodine has a short half-life of 8 days, and its biological half-life. The biological half-life of iodine is around about 100 days, okay? So that means if you have a short physical half-life relative to a longer biological half-life, the chances are the isotope is going to emit its radiation while it's inside you. For cesium, it's very, very different. Cesium has a long half-life, physical half-life for 30 years, and its biological half-life, because our bodies don't stay this way. We breathe in, breathe out, take in with food, and I won't go about the other thing, but our bodies are constantly turning over. And for cesium, that turnover rate in biology terms is about 70 days. So it's extremely unlikely that much of the radiation taken in as a single dose would be released. So that's why cesium doesn't give you a large dose, and it doesn't concentrate anywhere in the body at all. So the people living in the Chernobyl area who lived on the contaminated ground, some of it was cleared, but a lot of it was still there, had about the equivalent of a single CT scan spread out over 25 years due to the cesium, which is why we don't see anything other than thyroid cancer. And I'm sorry, I forgot your first question.
Metastasis.
Oh, metastasis, yes. The problem there is you have to know you've got a tumour in order to correlate metastasis. Now, thyroid cancer actually doesn't grow, and when it metastasizes, particularly in the young, giving a high dose of iodine kills the cells very effectively. So much so that the death rate from thyroid cancer is about 1% over 50 years. It's not your average cancer at all. It is something that we have the best targeted treatment for of any cancer we have, and that's strangely, high doses of radioiodine because it is so exquisitely sensitive and takes up the iodine and holds on to it. So it's unlikely to increase metastasis because you'd have to have a fairly big tumour that was capable of invasion there to do anything. We have no evidence at all that radiation can increase metastasis. If anything, it's more likely to kill off cells, so it's likely to decrease metastasis.
Okay, over here. Yeah. And we'll come back to you, Todd.
My name is Kurt Sieber. I'm an associate member. I have two questions. The first one, a pretty simple one. Is the useful lifetime of nuclear plants in the UK, is that similar to Japan, where you have an original lifetime of 40 years and with the possibility of an extension for 20 years? How is that in the UK?
Sure, I can answer that. So we have quite a different type of reactor fleet in the UK compared with, I'm afraid, anywhere else in the world, because we went down a different route. We decided to use something called advanced gas cool reactors. So these are graphite moderated and cooled by carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide then goes through a heat exchanger, boils water, and the water turns the turbine. In Japan, your reactors, you have two types of reactors, but in both cases, the nuclear fuel is cooled by water, and you use the water in order to heat exchange to raise steam. And because of that, you can't really compare the two fleets very easily. I would say that the fleets that you have here in Japan have an advantage that you have all the research that's gone on in all the other reactors around the world in order to increase your understanding of how long those reactors will stay useful for and how to prolong and develop the lifetime of those reactors safely and securely, whereas in the UK, we only have our own reactors and our own research to support that. So I would guess that the reactors in the UK will probably not run for quite as long, on average, as the reactors here in Japan, because ours will probably end up having slightly shorter lifetimes.
Yeah, but you mentioned that you were the first with the reactors,
Yes.
the first with the decommissioning, so you must have a certain figure in mind. I mean, when you say less...
Well, we actually, we've already decommissioned an entire, well, almost an entire fleet of reactors, which were called Magnox reactors, which was different again. And that was really the first reactors to create electricity. And those even use different fuel than is used in the reactors in Japan. So there is commonality. There's commonality in the sorts of ways that you go about safely and securely removing nuclear materials from sites, but the details of some of the activities are going to be different. We did, however, have water-cooled reactors very early on, which we've also decommissioned as well. So you know, it's as usual. It won't be exactly the same. It'll be slightly different, which actually makes that experience more interesting.
Okay.
Can you say what was the age at which these reactors were decommissioned?
Well, so the Magnox reactors, I'm going to look to one of my colleagues who's getting his bag out at the moment, but my memory is they varied from something like 35 years to about 45 years.
Okay.
I think the longest was 50 years.
Okay.
And actually, we still have one of them running. And to be honest, it is so engineered such that it could probably keep going for decades and decades longer. It was probably, we could argue, it's over-engineered.
Okay, thank you very much. So the second question is, you were talking about the water treatment, and for the amateur looking from outside at Fukushima these days, and what you see in the papers and so on, what you mostly see is a uncountable number of water tanks. How do you think the water treatment problem, or the water management problem, as you called it, is being handled? And in the same connection, there is this story about the famous ice wall, which they have been trying to build into the ground. I mean, a lot of the worry in the Japanese population is that more and more of radioactive substance is going to be released into the ocean, and so I would like to hear your comments about that.
This is, of course, a very sensitive issue, to say the least, as you've just said. What is occurring at the moment is that the water is being collected at the site, so that these materials are not being released into the sea, or if there is any release at all, it is so incredibly small. It's actually an extreme challenge to even measure it. And one of the things that's characteristic about these sorts of materials is we can measure astoundingly small amounts. The public in Japan, it seems, wishes the situation to be such that these materials are all collected. There are other ways that it would be possible to deal with these materials, such as, in fact, diluting them tremendously. So you have two options. You can collect and concentrate, or you can dilute and dispose out into the sea. And at the moment, the decision is being to collect these materials. While you collect these materials, there are some species that you can remove from them extraordinarily effectively. The cesium, strontium, these sorts of ions can be taken away really amazingly completely. But you are still left with some material there which at the moment is being collected. What will be done in the long run, I'm not sure, because I'm going to answer this question truthfully with my academic hat on. Okay, actually, dilution and removal out into the ocean of the sorts of amounts of materials that you're left with after you've removed the cesium iodine, cesium and strontium, which has been done, is extraordinarily small. But it isn't publicly acceptable to do that at this time.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. If you just put that in the ocean, it would be insignificant.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, Todd.
A question for Dr. Thomas. You mentioned in passing something that Japan did right in this issue. Some of that went by me, and could you tell us again what Japan did right on this?
Yeah, I think there are a number of simple things that it did absolutely perfectly. It was necessary to move some of the population away because it was an unstable situation, and I think they took the right decision in moving the people away. Yeah. Whether they should have been allowed to move back earlier, I think, is actually more of a political decision than a radiological one in many respects. But they did the right thing by moving that population away very, very quickly. I don't think there's another country in the world that could have done it in the way that Japan did it. Certainly, if you tried to move the population of London anywhere, I don't think you'd get anybody getting on those buses. So I think, they did that extremely well. They gave some very simple and easy to follow instructions that help reduce contamination. Now, to most people who've never been to Japan, they didn't understand why this was being said. But don't hang your washing on your balcony, because when you bring it in, you'll bring in contamination with you. Now, most people in the UK would stick it in their tumble dryer anyway, wouldn't see a washing line, because it rains most of the time. So a lot of people didn't understand why that was such good advice, but it's really simple and easy to do. Just keep your windows and doors shut. We tend to think of radiation as if it's something different. If this had been a chemical exposure, while the cloud that contained the chemicals passed overhead, we'd have been told to do exactly the same thing. Stay in, keep your windows and doors shut. So that reduced contamination and dose to the public quite a lot. The other thing that Japan did, which it was impossible to do in Chernobyl, was to cut the food chain. Now, we knew from all the stuff that we knew about Chernobyl that actually taking food that was contaminated in and milk and drinking milk that was contaminated increased the dose of the population quite considerably. The Japanese said, right, that's it, stop. And they effectively cut off the food chain, and no contaminated food, very little of it. And in fact, by European standards, we wouldn't even regarded it as contaminated, because our standards for radiation are that much higher than they are in Japan, in that we will take in more radioactivity contamination in our produce. So they did all that absolutely correctly. There is one other thing which some places did and some didn't, and when you understand that you had no fax, you had no email, and the way that the Japanese population likes to be told what to do centrally before it does it, they could have given out stable iodine to people. In some places they did they acted locally to do that. But actually, stable iodine, so just iodine, potassium iodine tablets that don't, non-radioactive. And that basically just floods the thyroid gland, so there's no room for the radioactive isotopes to go into the gland. In the doses that we saw, it actually didn't matter a damn that they didn't do that, because the doses were incredibly low. But that was the one thing that they possibly could have done better. But everything else, they did by the book. And so it proved that people had learned the lessons of Chernobyl. What they didn't learn how to do is to handle the psychological issues of mass evacuation, and I hate to criticise people in the room, and it may not have been you, but the international media went berserk. I was embarrassed at the headlines and some of the comments that I had thrown at me while I was working on some of the BBC channels in the UK. The words that were being used, apocalypse and things like this, were just totally wrong in the circumstances. Having seen 20,000 people killed in a tsunami, to talk about nobody being killed from the radiation and term that an apocalypse was wrong. But that's the word that people will hear, and that's what people associate with the radiation. So we need to be much more measured in responses to things like this, because you create a psychological stress on a population which is, basically totally unfair, considering what else the population has had to cope with as well.
I absolutely couldn't agree more.
Well, I can certainly say that those irresponsible headlines didn't come from any of our members.
I'm sure it didn't. But it was interesting because I was getting a lot of emails from people who were British residents or English speakers, at least in Japan, who were getting one story from the Japanese press and another story from the international media headlines they were reading. And the worst thing you can do to a human is saying, I've got two different stories here, now which one do you want to believe? That creates so much stress.
Yes, that's right.
That, you know, that sort of thing must not be allowed to happen again. You report the truth, just don't report sensational headlines. I know it sells newspapers, but think of what that does to a population.
I think we have time for one last question. Okay, over here.
Nicholas Smith, CLSA. My recollection is when the French nuclear response team came out here, they were saying that actually the acceptable radiation limits in Japan were a lot stricter than Europe. No, sorry, that was different from what you seem to have just been saying.
No,
the problem was that it was so...
We accept higher rates in our water and our food than you do in Japan.
So surely this was the problem in Japan, was that the rules were so strict that they're great when things are going right, and you can't downgrade your rules when they go wrong.
Yeah, sorry if I yes, that's what I meant, even if it wasn't what I said. Yeah, I mean the fact that they then reduced those still further actually didn't help either, because people, when you reduce something, you then start thinking, well, it wasn't safe before, and that was the wrong message as well.
So the truth is they're unbelievably safe already.
It's 1,200 becquerels per kilogram in Europe, and it's 500 becquerels per kilogram or per litre in Japan. So you can see how much more stringent the Japanese regulations are. 1,200 becquerels per kilogram or per litre, and it's 500 becquerels per kilogram in Japan.
Is that an alpha?
That's just general.
It's just total. And we should point out that the European values are very conservative anyway.
Yeah, and I should tell you that in scientific jargon, a becquerel is called a bugger all, because a becquerel is insignificant.
Please don't print that.
Yeah. Hopefully that doesn't translate into Japanese.
Actually, we do have a little bit of time left, and I have a question this time for Dr. Grimes. Over the last several months, there have been some of the conversations that went on among the workers at the nuclear power plant have been published in the local press here.
Oh, have they?
And one of the things which came out is that those people were worried that when it seemed the reactors were spinning out of control, they were worried that it was going to necessitate the evacuation of Tokyo. Mm. Was this a reasonable concern, or was this over the top? Would Tokyo ever be in any danger from a catastrophe at that distance? And another, I'm sorry, I didn't see this paper myself, but someone told me that someone has looked at, the wind patterns. Mm. We were very fortunate because most of the radiation got blown out to the Pacific. And the accident had occurred at a different time of year. Yeah. It's quite possible that a lot of that, much more of that radiation would have been blown towards Tokyo. Any comments on all that?
So the weather patterns, the interaction of weather patterns with releases of radiation and the predictions that you make are absolutely crucial. And the good news is that we're actually very good at making those sorts of predictions. It's not, in fact, just the direction that the wind blows, but it's also the type of weather that you're getting. So in Chernobyl, for example, the wind blew, and it blew over great swathes of Europe, and it didn't deposit any of the material, and thus those areas did not receive any very, very little amounts of contamination.
The isotopes come down in the rain, so if it doesn't rain, because they're up in the upper atmosphere, if it doesn't rain, they don't come down, and they just blow around in the upper atmosphere.
So I was going to, absolutely, and I was going to say, because we've got at Cornwall already, I was going to say, and they got to the Welsh Hills, and as people in Britain know, that in Wales it rains a lot, and so actually more material came down there, even though it was very little.
And it was only cesium, because by the time it
It
got to us,
there, all the
iodine
iodine
had
are gone, but nevertheless, so it's a complicated pattern. So just because the winds might have been blowing towards Tokyo, it still doesn't mean that Tokyo would have received a considerable contamination at all.
If you haven't noticed, it rains a lot in Japan too.
Yeah.
Absolutely, but what I'm trying to get here over is the idea that this is a complicated issue with lots of factors affecting it. But the good news is that we're actually very good at predicting a few days ahead of time weather patterns, types of precipitation. We understand what the releases that were occurring. So if there had ever been a position like that, we would have been able to give reasonable warning. However, the releases from the reactor, even though they did indeed, as they were, blow out into the ocean, they were still very small.
Yeah.
As we say, you said
It's about
it was
10% of the equivalent for Chernobyl. So it was, although it was on the same scale the IAEA used, actually the releases are about 10% overall.
And those sorts of releases, a tenth is a big difference. I mean, it's not obviously a tenth is a tenth, but actually the effect of a tenth is much less than it is of the whole of Chernobyl.
And as it was iodine, and iodine is the one that we worry about, it would have been very easy to do something to protect people about that. Cut the food chain, which is where most of the contamination comes from, and you would have been able to do that even if Tokyo had been affected. And it's the likelihood by the time it got here, because it's still got to travel across, and it's got a half-life of 8 days, so it wouldn't have arrived here very quickly. It would have taken a time to get here. And we saw that in Chernobyl. If you look at the areas of Russia, and there's a small part of modern-day Russia, because of course it was all the Soviet Union then, that borders with Belarus and Ukraine, actually the increase in thyroid cancer in that region is very, very much lower than in the northern area of, the southern area of Belarus, which is where the wind was blowing first, because it really matters how quickly that iodine travels. If it takes a week to get to you, it's going to be half the amount that was released the week previous.
So there are two issues here. And one of them is that, of course, you are always balancing the removal of a large number of people and all the psychological implications that creates. So you're balancing between that and the effect that the contamination may have had on the population, given all the things that Gerry has just said. But of course, you are talking to two scientists. And the trouble with talking to scientists, and as science people, you all understand this, but the general public doesn't, is that we will never say something is utterly impossible, because we're scientists and we can always imagine ways that things can occur. So we can't say never, but we can say highly unlikely. And I'm afraid that's what we all have to bear.
And I guess we'll have to end on that encouraging word. I always get the last word when I'm the MC, and I'd like to give each of you, as a token of appreciation, a one-year honorary membership in the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. Since you're both coming back to Japan often, please come by and see us again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.